节目最后仍然要为大家带来的是华尔街联报为大家带来过去几个小时的最新新闻报道和评论。其中说到我们实用性的消息，特别为大家推荐的是来自 BBC 的一篇报道。那我们的这个 AI 系统也在第一时间进行了搜集和整理。有的时候在求职的时候，你可能不小心一脚踏入了陷阱，这到底是怎么回事？现在就有这样的一些不法分子会利用招募的名义探取你的更多的个人信息。现在呢，美国很快现在是毕业季很快又到了求职界和找工作界，特别是我们刚到美国的这些年轻的朋友，在寻找工作的时候，一定要打探清楚对方到底是怎样的底细，当心中了以求职为名骗钱或者是骗取个人信息的更多陷阱。谢谢观众朋友们对于我们的支持。以上就是我们为大家带来的今天的华尔街论坛的全部内容。感谢甜点，感谢艺人，感谢云水，感谢如是我们。稍后华尔街电视思想先驱报再与大家继续聊外交方面的更多消息。
随着中国迅速崛起，乌克兰战局持续升温，以及金砖国家联盟全球经济实力逐步增强，众多观点认为，我们正迈向全新的多极世界秩序，标志着美国主导和单极格局的时代逐渐逝去。那么，单极、多极和美国主导这些词汇究竟意味着什么呢？而如果我们正身处于新的多极世界秩序中，究竟会是混乱还是和平？我们的时代是否将迎来自由或压制？
I'm interviewing Amir Kiai, the policy coordinator for DM25. And I think that's a good place to start. DM25 stands for the Democracy in Europe movement for 2025. And it sounds almost like there's an implication that there's not yet democracy in Europe. Do you want to explain what DM25 is?
Yeah, sure. I can also maybe tackle them. Hi everybody, and hi Henry. I can try to tackle a little bit that your subtext of that question, which is about democracy in Europe, and we see from our analysis that in the classic sense of power of the many, democracy, it doesn't exist in Europe in that sense, versus what our analysis shows to be an oligarchy, power of the few. And in this sense, it is actually built into the institutions of the European Union, and of course we're not just talking about the EU but the wider Europe. But even if we look at the primarily through the European Union mechanisms, I mean the European Parliament needs to co-legislate, it doesn't have right of full initiation itself. A lot of the power sits with quite some various committees within the EU mechanisms. There's over 140 different working groups, etc., made up of ministers and technocrats that are not really accountable to the wider public in that sense. I mean, if you use elections as a metric, if you like. So it's the institutional design of the European Union itself is prefers, let's say, oligopolistic, if you can use a business term. I know maybe for your speakers, for your audience, might make more sense in that sense. But yeah, so we definitely see that, and we've seen in terms of the big moments that have happened in Europe, of course, the war in Ukraine, etc., the refugee quote-unquote crisis, and so on. We often see that the decision-making is really happening in small circles without any real testing of those decisions with the public. So we don't see it as democratic. Using those limited terms, of course, I can expand on it if you wish. And so DM25 was founded in 2016. As in a way a response to the what you could see was a disintegration of even the little, let's say, political possibilities that exists in Europe in that sense, and we could see that unless the trajectory that the European Union is taking is very much towards even less and less of this, and it either has to democratize or it will disintegrate. And our analysis already has shown that with Brexit. Of course, and we can see there with the rapid rise of the more rightist views and alt-right backlash, etc. That's happened in Europe and so on. So that's where we sit, and the biggest way to address these concerns is not to channel more power into the hands of few, but to bring about more transparent and more democratic institutions. And that's the best weapon, if you like, against this.
And if you could briefly explain also how DM25 relates to the Progressive International and Mera 25, because I sort of understand you guys as sister cousin organizations, or?
Sure. I mean, DM25 was one of the co-founders of the Progressive International. And Progressive International has if you like, a more global remit, and it brings together movements and organizations and parties and progressive, forces throughout the world to really realign global politics. So that's, if you like, the Progressive International in that sense. And then our movement, DM25, besides its movement work, and when I say movement work, I'm talking about campaigning, petitioning, protesting, and so on, the typical, let's say, social actions that we would do from outside, if you like, the framework of power. We also realize the progress of humanity in terms of having elections and still representative democracy, etc. And we also provide the alternative for the public, if they choose to vote for policies that the movement is setting. And those are the Mera 25s. So our political parties are called Mera 25, and they are, contesting elections where we have them. And those are in Greece, Germany, and Italy. For the moment, of course, we're looking to expand it.
And so then I guess we'll get into the topic of my series, which is about multipolarity, right? A lot of viewers in China are now describing this time that we're living as multipolar, or we're moving towards shifting poles of power. Do you buy into this idea that we're in a new multipolar world? Do you think that's a fair term, or?
It might be partially a desire to move into a multipolar world, and that would probably be, let's say, politically and hegemonically speaking, better in terms of, the worst of the evils. If we sort of still maintain sort of big power structures globally, then a multipolar world would be much more helpful in terms of what we are seeing right now globally, in terms of the global crises and confluence of conflicts, etc. At the same time, we also see that in reaction towards moving towards a potentially a peaceful multipolar world, we also see the hegemonic powers coalescing as much as possible, and we have had in our grassroots position making and policy making, we've had some discussions about this as well internally in movement, and we see that there's that potential for it to go to the multipolar world, but we also see it progressing into possibly a bipolar world again, and Europe being, dragged along with the United States, and which is not what we would like to see. We would like to see a non-aligned Europe, politically speaking, being a force for good for the world.
So I guess this is a great point to bring up. I've seen that Yanni Varoufakis has tweeted about leaving NATO, and you retweeted him. So is that part of this policy to try to move out of the alignment of, or the sphere of influence, I guess, of America?
You see, the question about NATO is a fundamental one. And, when we talk about non-alignment, and political non-alignment also means military non-alignment, economical non-alignment, we suddenly, this is a concern for us, because the moment, we've seen the pivot to Asia under Obama, and then the increase on trade attacks, let's say, with China, etc. And then suddenly in the German annual security strategy process, China became a country of concern, or whatever term is being used in Germany right now. And it's not true. I mean, there's no, we didn't feel any differently, and I live in the Netherlands, about this. So we are in a sense forced to follow the lead of the United States, because we are not independent of the policies made in Washington, D.C. So, and that NATO is a part of that, of course, and it's that's perceived defensive benefit of being in NATO, and the relatively, let's say, smaller armies and navies and the military of Europe means that there's a perceived, again, dependency on the United States, and so we follow that along. So that NATO is part of that architecture, and for us to be independent, it means we have to move out of NATO.
So then, does that also mean that you want to retreat from the war in Ukraine, or maybe retreat is not a good word, but would you like Europe provide less support to Ukraine, or be more active, for example, in ending the war? I guess is also part of that policy idea.
Look, it definitely is that we can't be sitting in a war, whether it's in Europe or anywhere else for that matter. And there's also other wars, luckily less so compared to a few decades ago on the planet. However, if there is a conflict at this stage, we should be doing everything possible to end it and not further it. There's, of course, the legitimate right of self-defense that we shouldn't forget about. That does exist in international law. However, we can't continuously fuel it, and on the other side, avoid any shuttle diplomacy, avoid any moves towards peace, avoid censoring any voices for peace. And this happens quite frequently, unfortunately, in Europe. The moment there's a trying to position a narrative around no to war, and also no to occupation, and no to annexation of Ukrainian territory, you either get blamed as a Putin supporter, or you get you blamed as the other way around, as a pro-war position. It's quite hard in Europe to move towards peace, unfortunately, for the moment. And maybe once the circumstances change come November next year in the United States, we might see that change, of course.
Also, you're saying that it isn't necessarily a grassroots-based sentiment, that it's sort of almost top-down about regulating how people speak about the war, rather than,
there's the huge, the fact that, we can debate the quality of Russian media, but the immediate shutting down of any kind of broadcast coming into the European IP range, for example, is a problem in that sense, because now, of course, people can access RT, etc., if they are willing to, but this shutting down of perspective, even though, we know that it's state propaganda, and of course, they're going to push the argument for why the war should continue from a Russian point of view. But we should assume people are intelligent enough to understand that instead of, cutting it off.
Google has barred Russia's state-owned media outlet and other channels from receiving money for advertisements on their websites, apps, and YouTube videos. Google has further banned downloads of Russian state-owned media outlet RT's mobile app on Ukrainian territory.
So that's just on the media side.
Right. Well, I am interested in the media thing, the media side of things, given where I work, I guess.
Exactly.
So then if you would like to pivot over to the refugee issue, which you did bring up earlier as well, it seems for a while that the media portrayal about the refugee crisis in Europe is that the more refugees are hosted, or asylum seekers are hosted in Europe, the more alt-right backlash there will be. Is this a fallacy that the media has created? Do you think there's a natural response to hosting refugees? Is there a gut reaction against multiculturalism in Europe?
It's a very good question, and luckily we can actually show examples, because again, with Ukrainian refugees, the European legal system, financial system, housing system worked incredibly well, rightly so. We in our house ourselves hosted 3 refugees from Ukraine, and we could see how the system responded really as fast as possible to hosting the right kind of refugee. At the same time, we are willing to see the continuous death in the Mediterranean and in the Channel Islands, etc., of refugees trying to cross. We had 700 people drown in one incident. And what's sad about this incident is that there were, Frontex equipment, helicopters, Greek Navy ships, etc., all around. And we let 700 people drown. And this points to the reality of how policy is made on refugees in Europe in terms of an actual acute response. Now, we also have to go further back. We have to go and look at the root causes of the refugee crisis. It didn't just happen overnight. Of the global, 108 million refugees now, according to UNHCR, etc., 60 to 70% came as a result of the war on terror. The wars in the Middle East for the past few decades have created a lot of refugees. The bombing of Libya, has created a lot of refugees and also created a channel for refugees and so on. So these refugees aren't just here because, it's a better life and they just happen to wake up and they want to come. No, Europe has a very significant role by supporting, again, NATO policies, American policies, etc., has a significant role to play in the causes of migration. We've also been supporting dictatorships where people are fleeing from. Europe has been a strong supporter of its former colonies when they ruled by dictators and so on. We see this in Egypt, military coup d'etat we still supported. We see this now in Tunisia, where the Dutch prime minister actually went to visit recently and signed a deal, etc. So Europe is very much part of creating the problem politically. To your question about the role of the media doesn't actually address the root causes. Doesn't say, we actually bombed these countries and this is the consequence of it, and we are responsible. So that link is not made at all for the minds of the public. And the public is not necessarily always aware, of course, of all the military adventures that Europe is involved in. I mean, as even with Niger, there were Italian, German, and besides the French troops that everyone knows, there's also a contingent of Italian troops. Now, what are Italians doing in Niger? Nobody knows, and so on. So this is a problem. And I also just wanted to a little bit touch on what we talked on a little bit before, and it's not just moving away from NATO, as I wanted to mention, but also moving away from this idea of military blocs and militarization, etc. And we really have to sort of think broadly and talk and see it in a whole system point of view, because it's the 21st century. Every part of the world is connected. We can't continue thinking that, by pummeling a country, we're going to gain and they're going to lose. No, everybody loses. We have bigger challenges of climate change, etc., etc. We have to cooperate on. And then if you remove people from the table, we can't cooperate with them. So these are very important issues for this century. We can't use, 17th century thinking to solve our problems.
And so I'm hearing you say like, we don't want to align with someone else. There should be an independent and generally peaceful, multicultural, unit of Europe. That's the vision for DM25.
Of course, yeah, sure. And this is a way Europe works with its neighboring regions, works with the Mediterranean countries, the Middle East. Yeah, Europe still has a lot of historical involvement with that part in terms of what it's done with the former colonies. And I'm using the former because there are sometimes still existing colonies. And Macron was saying that they're a South American power because because of French Guiana. It's very far from France when I look at the map, right? So we have to, really realize that, we can continue serving, if you like, the will to power, or we can continue serving the will to good at a more philosophical level, but maybe that's, yeah.
And it's good that we've sort of arrived at the French troop presence in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, because there's been the wave of coups, and increasingly it seems like whether or not there is a coherent movement in Europe that's actively trying to position Europe more fairly on the global stage, but there's almost a new wave of decolonizing forces and whatnot. But it also seems that they're leaning into the Wagner mercenary enforcement in those areas to fight the Sahel insurgency. So is it just a sign of Europe's wane on the global power politics, as cynical as that is as a framework, um, or is it actually a legitimate decolonizing force, do you think?
Well, there's definitely within the public, there's that feeling of the need. And I mean, not that I can speak on behalf of the people of the Sahel, of course, as you can imagine, would be inappropriate as someone who's based in Europe. However, there is definitely from what we can see, a genuine feeling of letting go of the shackles of colonialism. We also see that not just in Sahel, we see it in South Africa, for example, where because during the apartheid negotiations, the political power did move hands, but the economic power did not. And the country is still paying the price for that. And there is an increasing movement that wants to expropriate, factories, farms, etc., that belong to Europeans, if you will, in that sense. So this unfairness that exists, whether it's in trade, whether it's in relations, whether it's even with humanity. Again, we see this with the refugees, right? So certain refugees are allowed in, certain ones are not. The famous, Joseph Borrell's thing about the garden, etc. These, at that level of the dehumanization, that's, I mean, if we put ourselves in the feet of somebody who's living in Mali, we would also feel that. And we would also want to be free from that. So this is it's a real thing. So you touched on Wagner, you touched on other groups, and you will see that this is happening. This will happen because there's a vacuum now, and those forces that are working against, the one side will exploit it and will promote their own interest. And that's again also unfortunate, because at the end of the day, the public might not actually realize its, let's say, dream of a free Sahel, for example, in that sense.
I guess if you're ready to, I can ask you the big questions. Do you think that the proletariat or the precariat of the world will benefit from a shifting of power or a more even distribution of it, multiple poles?
The precariat will benefit if the power actually comes to them. If the poles might shift, and as a result of that, we might see maybe less global conflict because of the multipolarity. Naturally, if one were to apply a international relations framework to all of this, theoretically. However, the precariat, the miners in the Congo that have to mine cobalt with their hands for the iPhones, their life is not going to change if it's a multipolar, unipolar, or bipolar. And that's maybe the lens we have to look at it from that point of view. So the moving of the poles might maybe create more space for movements like us, for example, for progressive forces to maybe reach the public better, and so on and so forth. So that might help us in that, from that point of view. But as long as the power, whoever hands it is in, as long as it's in the hands of the few, the precariat will continue to suffer.
So that was, I guess, I had a slight question inside of that question, is the idea that now that we may be shifting towards multipolar power structure, if those power structures are still organized in a elitist or oligarchical or monopolistic way, the likelihood is that the proletariat, precariat will not see that devolution of power down to them. Do you think there's a chance for them to seize it, though?
Well, the seizing of power is a big issue. It depends, it's a big question in that sense, right? I mean, it comes down to sometimes being able to first see the alternative, and in DM25, we often talk about, one of our challenges that we try to overcome is what's called TINA, right? From Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative. The concept that there's no alternative, that this is the neoliberal economies, etc. The way things are is the way they are, and there's no way to alter them. That actually is a huge obstacle, because as you can understand, people will not participate in something when there's no hope to achieve anything. And so if the these moments of if the shift creates a huge amount of crises, and crisis is when people realize that's as I think, and I can't remember now who I'm quoting, but it was something like this: a society is always 3 meals away from a revolution, in that sense. So if there's a huge crisis, mass unemployment, etc., it might be, we might see that in a classical way of seizing power, as you're pointing out. But look, whoever is on the other side, of course, knows this, and they construct policies around it. So we're unlikely to see this. If you will, in your country, in the United States, I think, I don't know how many people die of fentanyl overdose every day. The opioid crisis by the Sackler pharmaceuticals, I think, costed 500,000 lives. I'm not sure if I'm using the right numbers, but thousands of people, families, the homelessness in San Francisco, etc. It's very visible that there's a crisis going on. And we're not necessarily seeing rising up to the extent that you might see, for example, with the pipeline, etc., that happened. There's some pockets of resistance, but we're not really necessarily seeing in this example of the United States, of where people saying enough is enough and we want to do it. We see it more in, with Chile, for example, and the more peaceful revolutions and transformation of power, etc. We sometimes see it, and those are the beacons of light, for us in that sense. But, it's a mixed bag answer I'm giving you, I know.
I guess in America, it seems like, I think in the first Republican debate, they were talking about how since Biden was in office, there have been 200,000 deaths of fentanyl. But it makes it seem like it's his fault personally, which is funny, right?
It's a crisis.
It's obviously a systemic policy failure.
It's a huge problem, and if the Pentagon spending is $800 billion plus more, and if the policing budget in the United States is around 250-300 billion, it's a huge amount of money that is actually not going to healthcare, that is not going to dealing with the mental health issues that makes people go towards narcotics, etc. as well. So it's not dealing with the root cause. And this model of let's keep the problems going because it's profitable is mad. It's the same with climate change. Let's wait until Shell has, found a way to decarbonize and then let them continue having the business. We're not really looking at, treating it as an emergency in that sense, So it's just everything becomes business at the end of the day. And that's really unfortunate, for a species that's come this far.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you brought up climate change. Do you see that a shift in poles and power will have any positive impacts on the climate change? Or, there are also the climate pessimists that see this as an era where everyone's just racing to get the last oil, coal, natural reserves that exist. I guess that's a very vague question.
No, it's a good question because, we can theorize about it, but we can look at the reality. The biggest delegation at the COP conferences has been the lobbyists for the energy companies. That should tell you, who runs the show, and where the attention and energy is going to, literally. Well, in that sense. So we don't see that. But again, it will be important for us and maybe for progressive forces, and we do this, to look at the shifting situation, especially, of course, with the BRICS expansion, etc., to look at the shifting situation, and we just have to use it in terms of, strategy, as I mentioned earlier on, for trying to reverse the lemming-like movement that we are as humanity towards the cliff.
Well, would you like to plug DM25 Progressive International? Is there a shot for Americans to start their own chapters? So that we might.
We have members in the United States, we have members on the African continent, in Asia, etc. So membership is open to any person who reads our manifesto and is aligned with our viewpoints, etc. So there's not a problem. So people can go to dm25.org and have a look and support us if that resonates with them. And I think one of the important reasons sometimes I am part of this is because we are actually trying to build the alternative literally, whether it's from a policy point of view or from a campaigning point of view, also creating democratic mechanisms amongst people to decide and deliberate and take it from there. So yeah, of course, it would be great.
欢迎您收看智库简报。社交文化的弊端让政府官员分心于真正的工作。南华早报评论版：香港的官员们被敦促减少参加社交活动的时间，更多的专注于履行职责。香港有大量政府和非政府组织活动和宣传活动，支持政府立场。然而，有人担心官员们花太多时间参加这些活动，限制了他们有效履行职责的能力。通过扩大他们的人脉网络，与新人接触，官员们可以获得新的观点，促进更具包容性的决策过程。最终，官员们需要优先考虑自己的责任，以保护香港作为一个领先的金融中心的地位。我还好，但事情很糟糕。纽约时报评论版：尽管美国经济表现良好，通胀率下降，实际工资上涨，但根据保罗·克鲁格曼在纽约时报的观点，公众对经济的看法仍然是负面的。他认为，人们更容易相信经济对他人来说不好，而不是对自己来说不好。他引用了一些调查显示，个人财务状况与对国家经济的看法之间存在脱节的情况。党派分歧，最近发生的事件，如 COVID-19 大流行，以及一种普遍的消极情绪，可能是导致这种看法的因素。拜登政府正在努力宣传其经济成就。香港对同性伴侣的裁决需要得到尊重和执行。南华早报评论版：香港最高法院裁定政府有义务建立同性关系合法认可的框架。法院驳回了活动人士岑子杰 Jimmy Shamtc Kid 的论点，即香港宪法中的结婚权适用于同性伴侣，并且他在2013年在纽约的婚姻应该在香港得到承认。然而，法院对于需要建立另一种认可同性伴侣关系的框架的裁决被视为重大胜利。法院暂停了裁决的执行2年，以便政府和立法机构有时间制定该方案。贝克简报：中国的有趣发展。詹姆斯·贝克公共政策研究所。中国政府在7月份的一份声明中宣布，外交部长秦刚已被免职，由他的前任王毅接替。美国领导对亚洲仍然至关重要。威尔逊中心：几十年来，东南亚一直是世界上最具活力的地区之一。蓬勃发展的经济增长提高了生活水平，推动了令人羡慕的技术创新，并使该地区成为一个至关重要的贸易伙伴。然而，现在该地区正处于变革之中。新加坡和印度尼西亚的领导层变动即将到来，中国的经济困境和侵略性外交政策让许多企业和政府感到不安。在这个过渡时期，美国的领导至关重要。来自华盛顿的支持和承诺的强烈信号将增强该地区对美国作为可靠的经济和战略伙伴的信心。美国的领导对东南亚国家至关重要。美国与该地区之间存在着密切的贸易、投资和安全联系。华盛顿被视为对中国的重要制衡力量，特别是在南中国海和台湾海峡的紧张局势升级之际。商务部长吉娜·雷蒙多上周对中国的访问受到密切关注。拜登总统在过去几个月中派遣了他最高级别和最信任的4名内阁官员前往北京，以期遏制美中关系的恶化。这一举动令人松了一口气。虽然这些努力似乎不会很快见到成效，但该地区的许多人赞赏美国对亚洲的承诺之举。前总统唐纳德·特朗普突然决定退出跨太平洋伙伴关系协定，使许多亚洲人质疑他们与华盛顿的长期联盟是否正在瓦解。拜登总统决定不参加本周的东南亚国家联盟 ASEAN 领导人峰会，也不受欢迎。在这种背景下，印太经济框架 IPEF 拜登政府对跨太平洋伙伴关系协定进行了削弱的版本，在很大程度上被看作是积极的。在亚洲， IPEF 并不被视为真正的贸易谈判，因为市场准入、约束性规则和执行机制并不在议程之内。相反， IPEF 被视为一个讨论论坛，14个参与国讨论供应链问题、环境保护和数字贸易标准等问题。这远远不及东南亚大多数人和美国企业希望看到的，但它表明拜登总统重视该地区，并希望他的政府参与其中。东南亚人也理解，美国的政治氛围不允许他走得更远，希望未来的政府，也许是拜登的第2个任期，可能会转向更加亲贸易的立场。这还有待观察。对于中国来说，没有这样的问题。中国与东南亚的经济关系几乎是共生的，每个东南亚国家都将中国视为其最大的贸易伙伴。但现在人们对中国最担心的问题不是其经济实力的展示，而是其日益严重的弱点。银行和房地产行业摇摆不定，青年失业率官方为 21%， 但大多数分析师认为至少是这个数字的2倍。北京方面的担忧表现在不再公布青年失业率的公开数据上。按照中国的标准，增长率相对低迷，约为 5%。7月份出口同比下降 14.5%， 进口下降 12.4%。每个国家与中国有着复杂的历史，新加坡的情况尤其复杂，在560万居民中，约 75% 是华人。此外，正如每个新加坡人都知道的，中国对该国商品和服务的需求占新加坡国内生产总值的 9%。尽管存在着强大的经济和文化联系，但企业家精神和资本主义的新加坡对中国共产党持有严重保留。中国声称南中国海的整体应被视为中国的，并对台湾的威胁不受东南亚任何地方的欢迎。人们也注意到，当中国在南非施加影响力并推动金砖国家组织扩大时，他并没有提倡将任何东南亚国家纳入其中的6个新成员之一。中国在东南亚的地位一直是主导的，无论该地区如何看待中国，中国都不会离开。更重要的问题是，华盛顿是否有政治意愿和智慧，以经济和战略上有意义的方式发挥其存在感，还是将舞台让给北京？协同效应而非摩擦，对于深圳合作是至关重要的。南华早报评论版。北京已向香港特首李家超提供了创新科技方面的关键绩效指标 KPI， 其中包括到2025年与深圳建立合作机制，并到2035年创建一个完整的跨境 IT 中心。深圳的科技产业已经超过了香港，香港一直在努力迎头赶上。国务院在落马洲环路的发展计划中概述了30项措施，以加快整合。香港和深圳需要共同努力，发挥各自的优势，缩小差距，并在 IT 行业培育新的协同效应。我如何参与这场战争？埃隆·马斯克支持乌克兰的未被讲述的故事。华盛顿邮报评论版。2022年，俄罗斯入侵乌克兰期间，埃隆·马斯克向乌克兰提供了 Starlink 终端设备。由于美国卫星公司 Viasat 的路由器遭到大规模恶意软件攻击，乌克兰军方的指挥系统被禁用。乌克兰官员向马斯克寻求帮助，2天内500个 Starlink 终端设备抵达乌克兰。马斯克和他的 SpaceX 团队努力打败俄罗斯的干扰，为乌克兰军方提供语音通信。该公司最终运送了6000个终端设备，到7月份，乌克兰已经有15000个 Starlink 终端设备在运行。媒体报道赞扬了 Starlink 在冲突期间对乌克兰的援助作用。然而，乌克兰在9月份试图使用 Starlink 引导装有炸药的小型无人潜艇对克里米亚的俄罗斯海军舰队进行偷袭时，出现了危险的局面。马斯克认为乌克兰发动这样的攻击是鲁莽的，并秘密告诉他的工程师们在克里米亚海岸附近禁用 Starlink 覆盖，导致无人潜艇失去连接并安全地冲上岸。当乌克兰官员请求重新开启覆盖时，他拒绝了，引发了强烈反对声音，并凸显了 Starlink 在军事冲突中的复杂角色。SpaceX 最终与五角大楼达成协议，为用于人道主义目的的终端提供免费服务，并为军事用途提供付费服务。然而，当这个故事曝光后， 马斯克撤回了资金申请，并决定继续免费资助乌克兰政府。SpaceX 随后与政府机构达成安排，为乌克兰支付增加的 Starlink 服务，并推出了一个名为 Starshield 的伴随军事服务。Starlink 向乌克兰发送了超过10万个新的卫星接收器，并将 Starshield 授权给美国军方和其他机构在乌克兰和其他地方使用。与巴西参议院主席罗德里戈·帕切科的讨论。威尔逊中心的巴西研究所最近举办了巴西参议院主席罗德里戈·帕切科的座谈会，讨论加强双边关系。出席的巴西和美国政府官员以及私营部门领导人，帕切科主席就塑造巴西未来和与美国的关系的几个关键问题发表了讲话。由前美国驻巴西大使安东尼·哈灵顿主持的交流，凸显了巴西在最近的挑战中的弹性民主。帕切科主席强调了当前进一步加强民主机构的倡议，赞扬在经济和环境改革方面取得的进展。帕切科说，在巴西，我们在共和国的3个分支之间有一个健康和建设性的环境，其他机构的监督以及新闻、媒体和公众舆论的自然审查。他强调了巴西参议院在推进从可持续发展到减少不平等的社会政策等国家优先事项方面的重要作用。这场有意义的对话提供了深化美巴之间建立在共同民主价值观基础上的建设性合作的见解。有没有人为台风萨拉中的动物安全着想过？南华早报评论版：台风对动物福利的影响经常被忽视，尽管它们给各种物种带来了严重的挑战。鸟类在狂风和暴雨中很难找到庇护所，而风暴潮引起的水温和盐度的突然变化可能会破坏水生生物。暴雨还可能引发山体滑坡，威胁到哺乳动物和爬行动物。例如，香港有大约24种青蛙、55种陆生哺乳动物、130种蜻蜓和570多种鸟类。本文呼吁将动物福利纳入灾害准备和应对策略中。当我走向尽头时，我渴望亲眼见到朋友们的灵魂相互连接。华盛顿邮报评论版：在纽约时报的一篇文章中，德克萨斯大学奥斯汀分校的哲学名誉教授保罗·伍德拉夫讨论了面对面交流的价值以及在线联系的局限性。伍德拉夫认为，网络联系不如面对面的交流好，因为他们缺乏只有亲自经历才能体验到的微妙暗示和深层次的连接。他还强调了信任和隐私的问题，指出真正的友谊需要信任和隐私，而互联网无法可靠地提供这些。伍德拉夫最后表达了对那些在他生命接近尾声时选择亲自探望他的朋友的感激之情。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。欢迎您收看科技简报。中国在研究产出方面居世界之首，现在需要提高质量。南华早报：根据2项研究，中国城市正在加强创新能力，以应对激烈的全球竞争。由 Elsevier 和 Springer Nature 进行的研究将北京评为全球最具创新力的城市，上海和深圳也排名靠前。研究还发现，中国的研究产出质量有所提高，但仍需采取更多措施，鼓励更大胆、更富有想象力的研究。研究还发现，吸引人才和优秀研究机构仍然是中国城市的重要优势。Shine 在高等法院起诉中国竞争对手涉嫌抄袭。英国每日电讯：中国时尚零售商 Shine 在伦敦高等法院对竞争对手应用程序 Temu 提起诉讼，指控其从 Shine 的网站上复制了数千张图片。Shine 声称 Temu 通过将其产品冒充 Shine 销售的产品来进行不公平竞争。Temu 于2022年在美国推出，并迅速在全球范围内扩张，已成为增长最快的应用程序之一，估计在英国拥有900万用户，并在全球范围内下载量超过1亿次。Shine 此前曾被指控从欧洲竞争对手那里抄袭设计， 并目前正卷入持续的法律纠纷中。尼克·奥斯特莫 Nick Ostmo 和伊利·吉尔曼 Eli Gilman 各自奔入2个触地得分，蒙大拿队以43-13击败犹他科技队。美联社周六晚上，蒙大拿在一场大学橄榄球比赛中以43-13击败了犹他科技大学。尼克·奥斯特莫 Nick Ostmo 和伊利·吉尔曼 Eli Gilman 各自为蒙大拿队进球2次，奥斯特莫冲刺118码，吉尔曼冲刺78码。蒙大拿的克利夫顿·麦克道尔 Clifton McDowell 完成了10次传球中的7次，总共94码。科比·特雷西 Kobe Tracy 为犹他科技大学传球209码，进球2次，但也被超截2次。蒙大拿队取得2胜0负的战绩，而犹他科技大学则陷入0胜2负的困境。霍普金斯传球4次 touchdown， 克罗斯基梅里特跑进3次 touchdown。西墨西哥大胜田纳西理工大学，结束连败。美联社西墨西哥州以56-10的压倒性胜利结束了他们的10连败。4分卫迪伦·霍普金斯传出了4次触地传球，而跑卫亚克里·克罗斯基梅里特则冲进了163码，并得到3次触地得分。洛波斯队的上一场胜利几乎是1年前的事了，他们在本赛季的首场比赛中以52-10输给了德克萨斯农工大学。霍普金斯完成了17次传球中的13次，总共273码，而克罗斯基梅里特则在开场阶段以1次47码的冲刺得分结束了进攻。田纳西理工大学的伊桑·罗伯茨传出了164码，并得到1次触地得分，但精英队已经连续输掉了5场比赛。霍普金斯和克罗斯基梅里特在休赛期从 UAB 转会而来。摩洛哥哀悼 G20 愤怒，燃油危机。周日亚洲简报。彭博社本周20国集团领导人就一份削弱的公报达成了妥协，这激怒了乌克兰。中国央行预计将降息，巴基斯坦央行可能会加息，苹果将推出包括 iPhone 15在内的新产品。俄罗斯和沙特阿拉伯之间的供应限制协议预计将推高油价，炼油厂由于高温而出现故障，新加坡将因为举办1级方程式赛车而关闭道路。美国太空部队将发射新卫星诺瓦克，德约科维奇将参加美国公开赛男子单打决赛。美国和中国正在进行一场真正的疯狂冷战。彭博社相互保证毁灭 MAD 的概念是美国和苏联之间冷战的一个重要特征。在美国和中国之间展开新冷战的今天， MAD 以不同的形式出现，相互保证的金融毁灭 MFID。2个超级大国之间的经济相互依存，加上他们的脆弱性和弱点，构成了阻止紧张局势升级为全面战争的威慑力量。然而，文章警告说 MFID 可能不足以保证不发生冲突，因为历史例子表明，金融考虑并没有阻止过战争的发生。文章还强调了美国和中国在台湾问题上可能面临的军事和海军挑战，以及这种冲突的经济影响。美国和中国是世界上最大的2个经济体，他们之间的战争将对全球市场产生灾难性后果。因此 MFID 的前景可能起到威慑作用，但它并非万无一失，升级风险不容小觑。即将进入家庭的最佳和最奇特的小工具。悉尼先驱晨报在柏林举行的年度 IFA 消费电子展上，展示了一系列智能家居技术创新。其中亮点包括飞利浦 Hue 的 Secure 系列安全设备，包括摄像头和接触传感器，使用户能够监控家中情况，并在有人意外进入时收到警报。IKEA 展示了一个智能家居中心，带有一个大型发光部分，可以对家中的动作做出响应。而三星和 LG 则展示了可以远程控制的 AI 智能家电，如洗衣机、烘干机组合。LG 还展示了一款可以在家中移动的电视。与此同时 JBL 推出了一系列智能音箱，可以同时运行亚马逊、Alexa 和谷歌助手。Dreambot L20 Ultra 是展示的清洁机器人之一，具有拉伸拖把清洁角落的能力。松下公司将在中国的软件研发中心增加 40% 的员工。日经亚洲松下电器在过去几年里通过在大连扩大员工规模，增强了其在中国的软件开发能力。 松下大连软件开发中心现有约1000名员工，成为该公司最大的海外软件开发中心。该中心专注于汽车应用、消费电子、家用电器等领域。未来计划招聘更多员工，并致力于提升其在语音和图像识别人工智能方面的能力。松下中国及东北亚运营公司将 FY 2025年的营收目标设定为1万亿日元，约合 67.7亿美元。尼克斯第13名的俄勒冈队以38-30逆转德克萨斯理工大学队，肖夫输给了他的前队伍。美联社13号奥勒冈鸭队在周六晚上发起反击，以38-30击败德克萨斯理工大学。波尼克斯 Bonix 传球359码，投出2次 touchdown， 其中包括1次在最后1分10秒的关键进攻，导致了1次射门得分。杰弗里巴萨 Jeffrey Bassa 在最后1分钟以45码的拦截回传 touchdown 为鸭队锁定胜局。德克萨斯理工大学的泰勒肖 Tyler Shaw 传球3次 touchdown， 跑球101码，但也负责4次失误。红袋鼠队自1990年以来首次0胜2负。哈德森卡德在漫长的天气延迟后带领锅炉工队以24-17击败大理石队。美联社普渡大学以24-17的比分击败了弗吉尼亚理工大学，经过漫长的天气延迟。普渡大学的4分卫哈德森卡德传球248码，并冲进了一个触地得分，带领球队获得胜利。比赛被一场雷暴打断，导致超过5个小时的延迟。弗吉尼亚理工大学在17-0落后的情况下发起反击，但在下半场表现不佳，尤其是他们的跑球进攻效果不佳。普渡大学的胜利是他们本赛季的首场胜利，也是新任主教练瑞恩·沃尔特斯的首胜。中国金融科技巨头蚂蚁集团推出自己的人工智能大型语言模型。南华早报中国金融科技巨头蚂蚁集团推出了自己的大型语言模型 LLM 和一个新的 Web3 品牌，以扩展其在金融服务行业中的生成式人工智能 AI 能力。该公司建立了自己的金融 LLM， 并将其用于升级智能理财和保险的面向消费者的智能金融助手智小宝。蚂蚁还推出了一个名为 Zen 的新的 Web3 品牌，目标市场为香港和海外市场。蚂蚁是中国几家大型科技公司之一，正在开发 LLM， 以帮助中国在创新的 ChatGPT 类服务方面缩小与西方的差距，阻止针对在线求职者的骗子。BBC 骗子越来越多地以虚假的工作机会针对求职者，其中问题在学生和新毕业生中尤为严重。虚假的工作广告出现在 LinkedIn 和其他知名的求职网站上，受害者通常被要求下载某些东西并提供个人信息。这些骗局可以用来窃取求职者的身份，或者以他们的名义申请信用。求职者还被要求提前支付金钱，通常寄来的支票会被拒付。中国希望到2025年拥有最多5家具有全球影响力的元宇宙公司。南华早报中国已经公布了一项发展国内元宇宙的行动计划，重点关注人工智能 AI、区块链和虚拟现实 VR 技术。该计划由中国5个部委发布，旨在到2025年培育3到5家具有全球影响力的元宇宙公司，并建立围绕这些技术的3到5个产业集群。该计划强调将元宇宙应用于家电、汽车和航空航天等各个行业。中国希望建立一个成熟的面向工业应用的元宇宙，推动制造业的新增长。涉及的关键技术包括区块链、VR、增强现实和混合现实。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。